All right, welcome everybody. My name is Jeff McGinnis, and I'm the National Beverage Director for the WineStyles family of stores. Whoa, just zoomed in really close on my face. So very happy for you all to be joining us this evening. As you all are aware, this is part of our National Winery Spotlight program. We've been doing this for, a number of years, but with COVID, we've had a lot of challenges, but also some amazing opportunities. When we went virtual, or we went sort of take home and you couldn't come see us in the stores, we wanted to find ways to continue to celebrate some amazing wineries, share a glass of wine with you, and tell the story of some great wineries that we love to talk about and share. I think you'll find that the winery, the story, the guests that we have this evening are some of the best ones we've had. We've done a partnership with them in the past, and I know their wines have been amazingly well received. So I know you're probably not here to listen to me chat. And more importantly, you want to start drinking some wine. So let me introduce our special guest. We have Peter Mondavi. He is the third generation co-owner of Charles Krug Winery in Napa Valley, California. He's going to be telling us, taking us through a journey of both the wines, a little bit of the history of his family, his passion for wine, their philosophy, and really what makes Charles Krug such an amazing brand, with everything that goes into it from the brand standpoint and the quality of the wine. So Peter, welcome. I'm very happy to have you here. I'm going to put myself on mute and enjoy some wine with you here and listen to the story that I know is going to be amazing.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. First, I'd like to invite everybody to enjoy a glass of our Charles Krug Sauvignon Blanc. While I go through some of the history of the winery. And I'd love to have this as interactive as possible. And I know we're kind of spread across the country in 3 different states, or 4, including California, and some large groups and people at home. So probably best to type it into the chat or talk to whoever's moderating in your group. But love to get questions and have this as interactive as possible. So first thing I would love to do is pull up a little PowerPoint. I hope you don't bore you with it, but I think it has some pretty interesting information about our history, about our family. So give me a second here to share my screen. There we go. Just a moment. Okay, so this is our one of our beautiful historical buildings on our estate. This is the carriage house built in 1881 by, of course, Charles Krug. And as noted up top, we're over 75 years of our family ownership here. Just a moment. There we go. So truly is a family business starting a long, long time ago. You can see my brother Mark and myself. I'm the short little stubby one there on the left. And things have changed a little bit over the years or the decades. But yeah, I started, I think I was 8 years old when I got my first paycheck, just doing little odd jobs around the winery. But we've been involved ever since. And here's our family, 2 branches, my side and my brother Mark's side. So you see all the family members there. We have 2 kids, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as I go through the family tree. So let's talk about the 5 generations of our family here at Charles Krug, starting out with my grandparents, Cesare and Rosa Mondavi. They were born in Italy. Married in December of 1908, and immediately about 2 weeks after their wedding, they jumped on, as I say, their honeymoon cruise, which ended up in Ellis Island in December of 1908, a very rustic crossing of the Atlantic because they didn't have much money. They landed with about $20 or $30 in their pocket, and that was it, and just the dream of what America could offer for the newlyweds. But they immediately made their way up to northern Minnesota to the Iron Range. Why up there, especially in December in the winter? They already had family and friends that were established up in the community up there, and they sponsored them to come into the United States. So my grandparents went immediately up there after landing in Ellis Island. And as a side note, my grandparents have no winemaking background in Italy whatsoever. Their parents, both respective parents, were sharecroppers in the countryside, extremely modest means. So they were very ambitious. They had all of about a third grade equivalent education, and that was it. But all the ambition there. So they went up there, my grandfather worked in the iron mines briefly, didn't like that, started a saloon. And that went okay until Prohibition set in. But let me talk a little bit more about our history with the Charles Krug Winery, which is why we're here. But my grandparents, after he got involved with the saloon, Prohibition set in, shut that down. He got involved with a grocery store. And because he was dealing with fresh produce, the Italians in their community, small group, very tight knit, encouraged my grandfather to go to California to buy wine grapes so they can make homemade wine obviously at home, which if you produced 4 barrels, about 200 gallons, consumed it at home and conspicuously, is more or less legal. So he took the train out in 1919 to California, did some deals, shipped some grapes back. And after a few years of doing that, he said, this business has potential. So in 1922, he moved, or 22, he moved the family out to California to focus all of his business efforts on shipping fresh wine grapes to throughout the United States, principally in the Northeast part of the United States, where there's big concentration of winemaking immigrants. Very successful, and that afforded my grandparents the ability to purchase Charles Krug Winery in 1943. So that's how we have our family associated with Charles Krug Winery. Let's talk briefly about Charles Krug. So Charles Krug, a Prussian immigrant, very well educated, but not in winemaking, but he was a journalist and kind of a thinker, philosopher type. And in fact, he was very vocal during the uprising in the mid-early 1800s in Prussia. Got in jail for about 6 months or so. Once he got out, he made his way to the United States. He actually taught in Philadelphia at the School of Free Thinkers, and then made his way to California. He worked he was the editor for the German language newspaper servicing the West Coast. He also worked at the U.S. Treasury there. So he did quite a few things, but similar to my grandparents, had no knowledge of winemaking. But he did hook up with Augustin Harasti, the Count, who actually founded Buena Vista. And those two learned winemaking together. And in fact, Charles Krug followed the Count up to Sonoma in the late 1850s and actually worked for him at Buena Vista Winery before moving over to Napa Valley. And how he did that is in December of 1860, Charles Krug married Carolina Bale. Why that is important is her family is very prominent in Northern California. And her family gave the newlyweds a dowry of about 600 acres of land in the heart of Napa Valley. So the next year, Charles Krug pursued his new love of winemaking and established Charles Krug Winery in the Napa Valley, the oldest winery in Napa Valley. And just kind of as a historical reference, that's the same year the Civil War began and President Lincoln was inaugurated as a historical reference. So it goes back some time. And oops, just a moment. There we go. But the wineries weathered many storms. I mean, we had the earthquake, Prohibition, the Depression, 2 world wars. But Charles Krug has survived throughout. It was shut down briefly during Prohibition, but outside of that, it continued to operate. And in the late 1800s, there was almost 200 operating wineries in Napa Valley, but shrunk obviously to about a dozen or so because of Prohibition. But it's one of the few that's still resurrected and really from that period, the post-Prohibition, World War II era, there's only 2 other wineries that are still family owned by the same family. And so we're one of 3, a very rare crowd here. But getting back to our family history, my dad, Peter Sr., and my uncle, Robert Mondavi, ran the winery after it was purchased. And then Robert Mondavi split off in 1966, went down the road a few miles to start his winery, of course, Robert Mondavi Winery. About a decade later, Robert still had ownership in Charles Krug Winery, and then about a decade later, my dad purchased that ownership from Robert. So from this point forward in the mid-70s, the Charles Krug Winery has been solely owned by my dad's lineage of family. And then in 2004, Robert Mondavi sold his winery, so there's no family left at Robert Mondavi Winery today. So we go on to the next generation. That's where I am. I'm on the far right here, the youngest of the whole group, but Robert had 3 kids, Tim, Marcy, and Michael. And of course, there was my brother Mark and myself here at Charles Krug. And then we have the 4th generation. So Tim with his kids, Marcy and Michael, and I'll talk a little more extensively about our branch. So Mark and Janice have 4 daughters. Angelina is the oldest of our group of G4. Angelina is the only formally trained winemaker, getting her master's degree in winemaking out of University of Adelaide in Australia. Alicia actually manages some brands that their family owns, some very small brands. I'll talk about those a little bit more. Rihanna is actually the only one who's on our full-time payroll at the winery. She works in sales and has been working in sales for a number of years. And Giovanna, or Gigi, works for a financial institution that's based out of Boston. And then our kids, Lucio and Leah, are the youngest of the whole 4th generation group. So our son, Lucio, graduated engineering with a master's and follows my love of cars and moved over to Italy for 4 years, worked as a vehicle dynamics engineer in Italy, and now came back and is going to business school on the East Coast, but loves the wine business, did a lot of work and research and education in Italy on wines. Her daughter Leah graduated oddly enough, in applied math, and but loves food, so she works for a food tech startup based in London. But she also represents us in the UK market, so she does a lot of tastings for us. But all of the 4th generation members on our branch of the family are ambassadors and get engaged with tasting and traveling, so on and so forth. So not to confuse the family wine business further here, but once Robert's family sold the Robert Mondavi Winery, Tim and Marcy started Continuum, beautiful high-end estate up in Pritchard Hill in Napa Valley. Michael started a little bit earlier, Michael Mondavi Family Estates, and also Folio, an import company representing family-owned wineries, and still involved, engaged with those, with multiple brands. And now get back to the family. This is our 5th generation. Carlos is a little over a year old, not drinking wine yet, but give it some time. We started pretty early with my grandmother, so just give it some time. And oops, there we go. Now getting back into the wine side of things, get even more complicated. Carlo and Dante, 2 of Tim's kids, have a beautiful Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir series called Rain. And here are the 2 brands, Dark Matter and Aloft, that Mark and Janice's 4 daughters own and operate. And Angelina is the winemaker. Alicia is the manager for those brands. So hopefully, I don't know if that clarifies or muddies up the picture of the family tree, but it gives you a little more of an idea there. So what I have here is a little video I'd love to show, which kind of gives you a visual overview and some background about the winery itself. Let's see here. There we go.
As you come down that grove of olive trees, you start to get a sense of history. You see these 2 historic buildings and you see 3 homes that the Mondavi families actually grew up in.
It's a beautiful old estate. I mean, it's the oldest winery in Napa Valley.
Redwood Cellar is a historical building built in 1872. About 5 years ago, we renovated it and built this very special room, kind of a dedication to our father, who was responsible for many of the vintages as the winemaker.
Peter Sr.'s dream was that someday the Redwood Cellar would be repurposed where the public would be able to come in and see this building. And during his last years of his life, he actually
Okay, so here's our vineyard properties scattered throughout Napa Valley. My father's philosophy was to make the caliber of wines we're trying to make. You really need to control the source of the grapes and the growing of them. And the best way to do that, of course, is to own your own vineyards. So outside of the winery property up in St. Helena, kind of the top left area on the map, bought that in 1943, of course. And then in the late 60s, early 1970s, Dad went on a land buying spree and bought a series of properties throughout Napa Valley in the Yountville region and the Carneros region, the very southern region. He never bought a vineyard property. He always bought fallow land, dairy land, pear orchards, other agricultural land, because, believe it or not, wine grapes were not the #1 agricultural product for Napa Valley until late in the 1960s. And then, of course, exploded at that point. And now it's probably, I don't know, 95 to 98% of the agricultural product here. But in the mid-60s, it was less than 50%. So that's why it was he could buy some of these properties that were not vineyards. And also he was amassing this land until it got too expensive for him, which was somewhere around $8,000 or $9,000 an acre. Today, if you were to repeat these purchases, you're in the, I don't know, $200,000 to $450,000 an acre for these properties. So he did very, very well for us. It supplies the majority of fruit for our Charles Krug wines. Then about 20 years ago, we purchased about 60 acres of forest up in Howell Mountain called Cold Springs, the very top of this map. So that's our mountain fruit, higher elevation, 1,700 foot elevation. We scratched out about 23 acres of vineyard land out of that. The balance is still remaining in forest. So it's some pretty spectacular Cabernet coming from there. It gives us more diversity. So here's just a picture of our family reserve barrel room. And through those arched windows in the very distant is actually our hospitality center. So you get a beautiful view when you come visit here. And here's actually the hospitality center. And this is actually in our historical Redwood Cellar. Now this cellar was built by Charles Krug in 1872. We've recently, relocated our hospitality center inside here, but it still functions as a winery, as you saw in the barrel area. So with that, I'm going to get start tasting. And I don't know if there's any questions out there at this point or not, but we can jump into, if there are, just let me know. But I can jump into tasting. So the first one, hopefully you guys have that, is our Sauvignon Blanc, Napa Valley. So one of my favorite go-to summer wines from our portfolio. Most of the fruit comes from the home property, from the winery here in St. Helena. And it's the first grape to come in. We tend to harvest early, or actually about mid-August, and typically done by about the first week of September, really before any of the other grapes come in, because this takes a lot of TLC. First of all, we night harvest, start about midnight or a little later than that, because it could be very, very warm in Napa Valley in August. It could get up to 100 degrees on occasions, but readily into the 90s. So at nighttime, we have a beautiful diurnal shift, so it cools down, so it gets down into the 60s, sometimes even the 50s. So that's when we pick. So the grapes are preserved a little bit better. Any bacterial activity that may occur on the grapes is slowed down or diminished at these cooler temperatures. So it preserves the grapes. And the other thing is we do have to chill the grapes down, the juice down anyway. So instead of wasting that energy of chilling them down, we let Mother Nature chill them down and then bring them in when they're considerably cooler. So once they're in, we let we destem and goes in a stainless steel tank in a reductive format. What does that mean? It means really in the lack of air, the lack of oxygen in the tank. So we use CO2 to blanket the tank. And what that does is it prevents oxidation of the juice. Think of an apple when you slice it and put it on the counter, come back a little bit later, it's kind of browning on the surface. Well, wine does the same thing. For much of winemaking, that is fine and encouraged. For Sauvignon Blanc, it is not, because that oxidation will diminish those beautiful aromatic characters of Sauvignon Blanc. So then the reductive treatment, it sits on the skins for about 8 hours, which is somewhat unusual for white wines. Then the juice is drained off into a tank again and fermented very cold. This is a technique my dad perfected in his university days back, I think about 1937, 1938. He was doing research on temperature effects of the quality of the wine during fermentation, and determined the colder you can ferment white wine, the fresher, more aromatic it will be, more reflective, representative of the variety itself. So we ferment it very cold, takes about a month. And then from there, we clean it up and into the bottle. It's typically bottled about the first week of December, give or take a little bit. We're an advocate of this style of Sauvignon Blanc because Sauvignon Blanc is a very delicate grape. It's very aromatic, very complex, but very delicate. So if you start putting it in barrels, things like that, these will start to impact and diminish the nuances that I love so much in Sauvignon Blanc. So we're in the camp where we don't do any barrel aging of our Sauvignon Blanc. And also the quicker we can get it into the bottle, the better, because we just retain all that freshness.
Hey, Peter, one of the questions that I often get, in the world of Sauv Blancs, you have California, you have the Loire Valley style, and then you obviously have the New Zealand style. How does California Sauv Blanc and specifically your Sauv Blanc kind of compare in the different realms and contrast?
I would say that we are leaning towards the New Zealand style. I'm not going to call us a New Zealand lookalike or anything. We do use New Zealand winemaking techniques. The reductive fermentation was pioneered in New Zealand. but their terroir gives them very extreme characters, whether it's asparagus or grapefruit or things like that. We don't get that extreme. And the other thing is unlike Cabernet, where Cabernet has a fairly narrow window of what winemakers would consider ripe and ready to harvest to make wine. Sauvignon Blanc has a broader spectrum, and early on, it's kind of a grassy character. As it matures a few more days, it gets into more citrus, grapefruit character. As it matures some more days, you get to more stone fruit character. If you let it mature longer, you get into melon, honeydew melon characteristics. So the winemaker can kind of dial in the flavor profile you're looking for. We started in the early side, kind of the little bit of herbal grass notes, but more in the citrus. Go to the old world, go to France, Loire, you get more, and again, this is terroir driven. I don't think we can really produce wine, Sauv Blancs like theirs. Much more steely, flinty character. Beautiful style, but different from ours. But if you were to put ours, Loire, and a New Zealand, people would definitely put ours more towards the New Zealand style. Other questions? Well, we can move on to the next wine, but I'll address questions because I know there's so many people we have to pour.
Yeah, let's hop into the next one because I think most of the people have kind of had the Sauv Blanc. They're ready for number 2, the Chardonnay.
Okay. Good, let's do that. So Chardonnay, it's Carneros, Napa Valley. So this is a property my father purchased. It was dairy land. He purchased this back in the late 60s, as I mentioned earlier. And at that point, Carneros was all cows, principally dairy. And Dad was like the second winery to purchase down there to plant grapes. Everyone thought he was nuts. They called him a maverick for going down there. But the price was great. It was like $2,000 an acre. But Dad had a vision. He wanted to do some of the Bordeaux varietals, white Burgundy, Burgundy varietals, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. Those are both cool weather grapes. He knew the Carneros was cool weather because it's the very southern end of Napa Valley, very close to the San Francisco Bay, San Pablo Bay, influenced by the fog that we get here in San Francisco that actually rolls through the Golden Gate and rolls up San Francisco Bay, San Pablo Bay, rolls its way up through Carneros, and then works its way part up the valley to maybe Yountville. And these are the wee hours of the morning. And then by later morning, mid-morning, it rolls back out the same way it came in. So Carneros is the first to see this cool fog in the morning and the last to see it later morning. So Carneros is, it could be 20 degrees cooler than St. Helena on a given afternoon. So Dad was looking for a cool weather area to do Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And then, of course, the rest of the world followed, and there's no more cows left. It's just all wine grapes throughout the whole area. But our style of Chardonnay is part of it's stainless steel fermented very cold. We talked about that, and to maintain that varietal characteristic, the freshness of it. The balance, about half, is barrel fermented, French oak barrels. We prefer French oak. So we have some neutral French oaks for second use and a little bit of new oak. We don't want a big oak character on it. We do not go through the malolactic, the secondary fermentation, which gives you your butter, butterscotch, banana characters, depending on how it's done. We want the varietal and the appellation to kind of speak for itself and not cover that up with heavy-handed winemaking techniques. So I think ours is I kind of call ours Chardonnay. It's a style for those who've gotten burnt out on Chardonnays. Where the Chardonnay's, you know, too big, too oaky, whatever, too over the top. I mean, that's an interesting style. Some people love it. That's great. There's a place for it. But we love a style where we can taste more of the varietal itself and the terroir where it's grown. And really, I think dominant for us is kind of a tropical notes, pineapple notes. Clearly, moving from the Sauvignon Blanc, little richer in the mouth, a little more viscous in the mouth, but still has some beautiful bright acidity in it. So we don't have to, but you don't have that really heavy character. Yeah, so interesting what people think of this, for especially those people who've gotten burnt out on Chardonnays, and you know, come back and try a few.
I guess, Peter, my question is, have you guys seen an uptick, you know, in Chardonnay sales? I mean, obviously there's been a roller coaster with pushback, and I would say some extremes in the Chardonnay world. And then having some nice, well-rounded, well-made Chardonnays, I think is starting to bring people back to it. But have you guys seen sort of a growth in this category?
I think it's always been a big, Chardonnay is a big category, as is Cabernet. I mean, those are kind of king and queen, or whatever, however you want to reference them in the whole wine arena here, well, in the United States and the world. So yeah, maybe a little uptick, but I think what's more apparent though is I call it, there's a little pendulum. It's not just Chardonnay, it's Cabernet and it's other wines as well, where it goes from one end to another end as far as style. And I see that pendulum coming off of that, you know, big, rich, you know, heavily oaked, you know, butter bombs, whatever you want to describe them, coming off of that to more balanced wines. Chardonnay is, you know, akin to what we have here. There were some knee-jerk reactions early on, where we had the all stainless Chardonnays, the naked Chardonnays, or whatever you want to call them. You know, we never, you know, our pendulum is very small swinging. It's not the big one, because we've been at this for so long. So we love a balanced Chardonnay, like, you know, I think the one we're presenting today.
Now, didn't you guys used to make a Fumé Blanc as well?
Yeah, we did. And you know, my uncle Robert really developed that at Robert Mondavi Winery back in its heyday. Before that, Sauvignon Blanc is based on Sauvignon Blanc, and Sauvignon Blanc was not all that popular until New Zealand came on the scene. So it was a fascinating, very successful marketing approach to developing it. But it did have oak in it, and as I discussed earlier, we prefer, you know, the unoaked Sauvignon Blanc styles. So we got away from that one as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to see all the different evolutions of some of these grape varietals, and how at the end of the day, you know, everything kind of comes back to the middle, right?
Yeah, it does. And, you know, people, which is, I think it's good because people experiment, and there's always going to be outliers on the extreme. So there's still people can experiment with, you know, some of these more extreme wines.
Okay.
From a winemaking standpoint.
Perfect. What is, I believe the next wine might be the Pinot Noir, am I right? Absolutely.
Pinot Noir.
This is what I love them all, but I'm a Pinot Noir man through and through, and this is one of my favorites from the bunch.
Oh, great. Very small production. I believe this is probably the smallest in the group here. Again, this is Carneros, Carneros Napa Valley. And I say Carneros Napa Valley because Carneros appellation actually spreads between Napa Valley and Sonoma County. So if it says Carneros on the label and that's all it says, odds are that the grapes are probably coming from both sides, Napa and Sonoma. If it says Carneros Sonoma, then obviously it's Sonoma side, and Carneros Napa is the Napa side. So we're on the Napa side. of the equation. Is there a difference between Napas and Sonoma Carneros? Probably not a heck of a lot there, but we're a Napa Valley winery, so we like to emphasize that. So I mentioned this was an old dairy farm, and Dad, bought that, planted it. So we've been growing Pinot and Chardonnay there ever since. And our Pinot, very consistent year after year. We get what I sense is an underlying kind of black cherry aromatics and character to it. We do, of course, it is barrel aged. Again, all French oak. That's all we do is French oak. Why French oak? Not because it's more expensive. It's considerably more expensive than American oak. But French oak has, I think, prettier aromatics to it, more refined aromatics. And the tannin structure on the palate, it's not as forthcoming as American oak. It's a little bit softer, a little more, and can have a little more spice to it as well. So that's our preference for French oak. Some people love American oak. So, again, there's choices out there. So it has that, I don't know, each vintage is different, but there's always this underlying black cherry for me. And it comes through in the flavors beautifully. Very soft, very silky, subtle tannins, as I think one should have in Pinot Noir. And colors, Pinot is definitely a lighter varietal color. And this is, I think, very representative of a Pinot Noir from a color standpoint. So I hope people are enjoying that.
Obviously, I kind of leaked what my favorite is, and I imagine they're kind of all like your children, but I tell my children, you might be my favorite today, and another one might be my favorite tomorrow. Are there ones that you either throughout the year, or the ones that you always gravitate to from this selection?
Well, first of all, it depends on the situation. I mean, it depends, what food am I having? What's the weather outside? So on and so forth, impact, my preferences. A hot summer afternoon for appetizers outside or whatever, Sauv Blanc. Big steak, Generations, VS Cabernet. But with that said, I probably frequent our Sauv Blanc and Generations, the two bookend wines tonight, more than the other ones. But again, it depends what food is with it, and typically I'm almost always have food when I have wine in front of me. Shall we do Merlot next?
Absolutely.
Let's see. So here's our Napa Valley Merlot. So Merlot can be a absolutely fabulous and incredibly well-respected variety. If you go to Bordeaux, some of the top red Bordeaux offerings are principally or almost exclusively Merlot. So some people kind of poo-poo Merlot, and in years past, there have been some pretty bad Merlots out there. But I think today we're moved beyond that, and throughout California. But I think one of the important things is actually probably with any variety is where you plant this, and I think Merlot tends to be quite sensitive. And we, Dad and I would take trips to Bordeaux and talk to them about winemaking and vineyards and all that fun stuff over there, and really learned how Merlot and heavier clay soils were very complementary. So over the years, we've sought out the heavier clay soils in our various vineyards, and that's where our Merlot is planted. What's interesting is clay is terrible for Cabernet, but extremely complementary for Merlot. So we start with the right location, the right terroir for Merlot, and really done properly, it's a wine that's very commensurate with a Cabernet: color, intensity, tannin, so on and so forth. And I think we've done a fabulous job with our Merlot. I'm going to brag a little bit, but why not? So our Merlot, if I'm at a restaurant and our Merlot's on the list, I just automatically order that one. Again, French oak on this one as well. We do have a little Cabernet and stuff blended in here as well. It's not 100%. With the exception, Sauv Blanc, Chardonnay, and I think the Pinot are 100%, but after that we're blending a little bit in the Bordeaux varietals. But good, intense nose, black, dark wild berry notes to it. Very fresh components. Those fruits, the black fruits come through wonderfully in the palate. Bright acidity. Dad was a fanatic about having good acidity, and that's really what makes a food-friendly, a food-compatible wine, is to have a good backbone of acidity in the wine. It also increases the longevity of the wine. Tannins, good, solid, but balanced. Nice length in the tannins. It's not, the tannins, I think, are complementary as opposed to, overpowering in the palate.
A couple of questions we did have. One question had to do with the different oak styles and why French oak is a little bit more nuanced and refined than American oak.
It's, call it terroir. It's literally where it's grown. Because we've actually experimented with this, others have experiment as well, of taking American oak, sending it over to Bordeaux and Burgundy, where the coopers are for these barrels that, cut the staves and air dry it. And air dry it in their terroir, and then coop it up into a barrel, and then it comes back to the United States again. So we've done that, and that barrel is distinctly different from the same barrel that's all produced in the United States, but it is not the same as a French oak barrel. It's distinctly different than that. So it's where it's grown, the wood, the oak, and also where it is cooped or air dried, I should say. Those are two important things. And again, it's just really the terroir that gives the oak that I would refer to as more finesse. And because of the nature of wood, you cannot get that type of finesse out of American oak. Again, American oak, some people swear by it, and it has wonderful flavor profiles, aromatic profiles, if you like that style.
American oak, most wine producers tend to use American oak on Bordeaux varietals if they are using it versus Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and other things, right?
Yeah, because I think American oak will leave a more substantial impact or footprint on the wine. Delicate wines can be overpowered by that. More substantial wines, Merlot, Cabernet, can hold up to that better.
And then the other question, or at least one of the other questions that we had from our store owner in Montclair, Arthur, his question is, how much input do you have versus Ms. Clark in the winemaking process, and specifically, do you have veto power?
Good question. The one that is most influential in our winemaking is Stacy Clark, our winemaker. She joined us the summer of, I think, 2011. So she's been with us for about a decade. She actually came from, excuse me, Pine Ridge, where she spent much of her professional career developing her skills there as well. So early on, the first a number of years, I worked closely with Stacy on style and so on and so forth. And we also hired her because her history, her palate, her winemaking philosophy was very much in line with our family. But I did work with her the first, I don't know, 5, 7, 8 years or so, tasting, so on and so forth, to make sure we're kind of all in alignment with the family once. So now she's really kind of driving things with some remote input from us.
Perfect. Great way to answer that question. I guess related to that, are there assistant winemakers that focus on specific varietals or categories of varietals?
We do not do that. Other wineries do. They'll have a red winemaker, a white winemaker, or whatever. Stacy is the type that she loves to she devotes her life to this, almost literally. And so she loves to have, the direct control over all this, which is, I think it's great. Nothing wrong with, separate winemakers for white or red or however, but that is how we look at it here.
Perfect. I think maybe I think we might be ready for the next wine as well, which should be the Cab. I have some questions as maybe we're tasting through that. Certainly COVID and things related to COVID have drastically impacted our industry, whether it's you're a retailer, a restaurant, or a winemaker. How have you seen that impact your winery specifically with winery tourism? Are you guys back open? If people want to come visit, is it encouraged? What is the current state of business out there?
Today, come on over. We're open. We're engaging people inside, outside, weather permitting, which, well, today's not good, but last week we were in the 90s. Yes, so we are wide open. Reservations required, which is pretty much standard now for Napa Valley. It was going that way pre-COVID, but now it's pretty much the norm. But yes, we're open. Restaurants are open. Life is coming back. I don't want to say it's back to normal, but it's starting to get that feel, which is wonderful. But during COVID, obviously the hospitality was shut down. People were not coming in for tastings. We did have, I forget what we called it, kind of drive-by wine purchasing. So you could actually order online, call in your order, arrange a time, you drive in and you pop your trunk and someone puts your case of wine in your trunk and they close it and you drive off. But during COVID, we didn't know what was going to happen, but as we refer to as direct to consumer, whether it's people coming here or internet ordering or wine club membership, things like that, that entire thing exploded. Not the people coming here to the winery, but people ordering from the winery. That just completely exploded. It's unbelievable the success that our direct to consumer had there. The 3-tier, the wholesale, going out to restaurants and retail stores, we had a good chunk of sales through restaurants, and that literally just died. I mean, there was a few week period was zero, absolutely zero. And it's slowly coming back. It's not to where it was, but it's coming back. Flip side, retail did increase notably, and you guys may have experienced that as well. Not enough to offset the loss in restaurant, but collectively with direct consumer, we were doing okay during the peak COVID times. So Cabernet next.
Yep, I think we're ready for that one.
Okay. So Cabernet is our lead item in our whole portfolio. When my grandparents bought the winery in 1943, it was late 1943, and the winery was in a bit of disrepair. So the first harvest we did was 1944. We crushed a myriad of different varieties, but we did a Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, and we did a Napa Valley Vintage Select Cabernet Sauvignon. So we did 2 Cabernets in 44. We still have those 2 Cabernets. This is our Napa Valley Cabernet. And behind me, I think you can see these wine racks. That's a collection of our Vintage Select Cabernets that go back to 1944. Only a couple bottles of 44. But the Napa Valley Cabernet is our lead item, represents about half of what we produce in Cabernet. So very well known for this wine. The sourcing is primarily from our own vineyards, a little bit from St. Helena, some blender from St. Helena, but Yountville is the lion's share of our Cabernet source for this wine. No Cabernet coming from Carneros. Obviously, it's a little cooler down there. Again, I kind of compare this to the Merlot, because the Merlot, I think these two are kind of commensurate in their weight and their character, as a demonstration of the quality of the Merlot. But again, more beautiful, bright red fruit on this. Little hint of wood, again, French oak on this one, about 1.5 years. Kind of nice, good, bright acidity in there, bright currant notes coming through on this wine. I get little hints of cocoa, but they're kind of fleeting in there. Again, tannins, soft, pretty elegant, nice length on the tannins, not overstated or overpowering in the wine. So this, very well received, and a lot of experience and love and care and family history goes into this wine.
One of the couple other questions that I have received is one, obviously there's a lot of other things. You have some limited release things that you have. Are those like winery only things or member things, or how do people have access to those?
Those are part of our direct-to-consumer program. Yes, we have a whole portfolio of limited release wines that Stacy has fun producing there. A couple hundred cases, depending on which one it is. These are only available from the winery, on the website, wine club. If you come in, you can taste them, purchase them. So as long as you're in a state we can legally ship to, they're available that way. They do not go through the 3-tier system.
I figured that. And then one of the other questions I see actually got texted to me was the business's stance on biodynamic wines.
We are sustainably farmed in all of our vineyards here. We're on the Napa Valley Green program, not only for the winery, but for the vineyards as well, to really preserve and also enhance our natural environment here. Biodynamics, we're not biodynamics. There's aspects, I think, of biodynamics that I think are fantastic. A vineyard is a living thing beyond just the vines. There are microbiomes, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And I think biodynamics does a beautiful job of addressing that. I'm not quite wrapping my head around, crystals and flower days and earth days or whatever. Can't quite get on that one, but there's a lot to be said about the biodynamics.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't. I mean, there's different levels of sustainability, I think, is what's important, right? And you've talked a lot about that, and there are some things that with biodynamics that are different, I would say, to say the best way to say it.
Yeah, but I think pretty much all biodynamics are sensitive to the environment.
Yep.
Beneficial to the environment. It's just there are, when you get really deep into biodynamics, there's some stuff that I just doesn't come naturally to me, but there's a lot of stuff that does.
Yep. I have a few friends that are, a few of my reps that are into the biodynamics, and they talk about when they're tasting wines, leaf days versus fruit days. So
leaf days or root days or whatever it is.
Yeah. So, well, I think one of the other questions I see popped up was the fires. The impact that the fires have had on Krug personally, or just generally, what you've seen happen with the industry, being kind of a leader out there.
Yeah, the fires that had the biggest impact on Napa Valley winemaking, let's just narrow it there because we could go on forever about fires in California, would be the 2020 fires, because much of Napa Valley was kind of ringed with fires, kind of wherever you go, you could see them. And the effects are quite visible as you drive around Napa Valley today on Highway 29 and Silverado Trail. The whites that came in 2020 are fine. They all came in before the fires, and the smokes came in. I mean, this is a general statement, but largely the whites were in. Some of the reds were in. And there was a number of reds, principally the Bordeaux reds, Cabernets. The later ripening reds were out. Because we have our own vineyards, we have our own winery, and we had our crew and everything, who was still fully employed during COVID and working here. We brought everything in and made it into wine. About 50% of the reds, mainly Cabernets, the later harvesting ones, about 50% of what we made had evidence of smoke taint. So we have sold that off into the bulk market. So another a big California winery buys it for a reduced price and blends it in, and it just kind of gets lost. So the 2020 harvest here in Napa Valley will be considerably smaller. There are wineries that will not produce a 2020 vintage. If you do see 2020 vintage wines from Napa Valley, from well-known established vintners, I think you can be very, very confident in the quality there. We just went through Premier Napa Valley, which primarily featured barrel auctions of the 2020 vintage. Very, very successful. The buyers were tasting these, and it was very, very successful. So I think that speaks well for the wines that are actually going to make it into out from the 2020 vintage. But it's going to be a lot smaller. I would be very cautious if you see a very inexpensive pop-up Napa Valley Cabernet that's a 2020 vintage, because there will people, negotiants and take advantage of that, buy it for low cost, try to strip it as much as possible and sell it out. And so if it's a tried and true winery in Napa Valley, then we all have a reputation to live up to, and we'll hold to that. And so I think if you see a 2020 from a good winery, then go for it.
Perfect. I think maybe we're ready for the last wine.
Okay, so we are Generations. We have a little stripe on this one. This is part of our family reserve wines. We have 3 family reserve. They're smaller production. We have Generations, We have a relatively new Howell Mountain Family Reserve Cabernet. And then we have our Vintage Select Cabernet, our flagship Cabernet I mentioned a little bit earlier. So Generations has a fun story behind it. My brother Mark, he was overseeing winemaking back in 1991. Towards the end of the season, very big season, prolific, meaning lots of grapes, lots of tonnage of grapes. And wineries were literally getting full, plugged up, where their tanks were full and they couldn't receive any more fruit. So this happened to a good friend of my brother's. He was delivering Cabernet Franc to Duckhorn Winery, and they couldn't take his last 5 tons of Cabernet Franc that he had in the vineyards because their tanks were full. So he called my brother Mark on a frantic call and says, can you take these in and do something with them? And Mark we're not growing Cabernet Franc at that point. So Mark says, let me see if I can, make some calls. But then he thought about it and looked around and says, we have some space. Let's bring it in tomorrow and see what we can do with it. So Mark, as kind of he operates, he brought in the 5 tons of Cabernet Franc, and lo and behold, we have some great Merlot coming in and some great Cabernet coming in. So Mark says, what the hell? 5 tons of Cabernet Franc goes in the tank, 5 tons of Merlot goes in the tank, and 10 tons of Cabernet goes in that tank same day, just to co-ferment, something we've never done before. We weren't dealing in blends. And so he did that, and kind of, I guess in hindsight, fortunately, Dad was on a sales trip in Southern California, comes back a few days later, and as he did most of his life, toured the fermentation tanks to taste the wine and see what's going on. And he came across this one and said Bordeaux blend on the tank itself. And he, confronts Mark, what's this? And Mark explained what he did. And Dad was a purist and really would think through things before he, acted upon them. But he was a purist, pretty much 100% varietal, things like that. And he just became unglued with Mark with what he had done. But over time, you would taste the tank when it was fermenting, and after the fermentation was complete, it went into barrels. And so Dad slowly fell in love with this, but we still didn't know what we were going to do with this. And in fact, we got to the point when we bottled it, we didn't know what we were going to do. So we bottled the first vintage. If you pull a cork on 1991 Generations, it'll say vintage 1991 on the cork. There will be no reference to Charles Krug on it, which was, we brand all of our corks. And then we bottled them in shiners, which means no label, no capsule, because we weren't sure what we were going to do with this. If we're going to sell these bottles to another winery to take care of our headache, or build a new brand, or sell them under Charles Krug. Then they sat in the cellar after they got bottled for a while. And then finally in '96, we came up with the name Generations after one of our cellar masters, good friends of the family for many, many decades, said, told my brother Mark to call it Generations after the multiple generations of family involved. So that's how Generations got started. And so that's the name, but it's a fun wine, a beautiful wine. This is a style of wine that I describe as having 1 foot in the new world here in Napa Valley, 1 foot in the old world, Bordeaux, in the sense that it's not as fruit forward as the wines we've been tasting earlier, which is consistent with the old world. It has a little more spice to it. Again, more consistent with the old world. Beautiful spice notes come through on the palate, and subtle herbal notes, which is classic for the Bordeaux style of reds. Nice tannins, a good finesse on the tannins. Very complex wine, but not an overpowering wine. This is such a gorgeous red. You can kind of sip it on its own when you're grilling a great steak, and then sit down and have it with the steak as well. That's probably why it's one of the wines I tend more towards when it comes to our reds in our portfolio.
Did you mention what the blend was?
This one's 84% Cab. This one has 10% Petit Verdot and the balance Merlot. Cabernet Franc, which we now do grow, Stacy is very finicky. Stacy, our winemaker, is very finicky on the ripening on Cabernet Franc. And Cabernet Franc, it's pretty finicky on ripening and here in Napa Valley. And if it ripens, it's fabulous. If it doesn't ripen, it's not, it's not worthy of a wine like this. So it can be very, very green and herbal notes if it doesn't ripen properly. If it gets to the right ripeness, then you get more, kind of potpourri, floral notes to it, as opposed to the kind of green notes. So Cabernet Franc doesn't make it into it every year.
Okay. So the blend obviously changed. She's looking for a specific flavor profile or just whatever the vintage gives her.
A flavor profile to a certain degree is dictated by the vintage.
Okay.
We're not talking Coca-Cola, where every year,
yes,
every vintage is the same.
Yes.
But yes, there is a flavor profile. There is a house style or whatever. We've evolved it to be Cabernet dominant. So this one's 84%. So typically they're 80 to 85%-ish Cabernet. And then Petit Verdot, Merlot, sometimes Cab Franc, those will vary. And again, French oak, mainly new French oak in this one, but she seeks out oak suppliers that give more spicy notes, because you have a little bit more spice in this one than you do on the other wines.
The other question that I got via text is productions. So production size of the different varietals that we've had.
They range wildly. Like Sauv Blanc is probably around the 30,000 case. Chardonnay is about 5, if I recall correctly. Merlot is, I think, 8 or 9,000 cases. Cabernet is up, a little bit bigger than Sauvignon Blanc. Generations down to about 1,000, 2,000 cases. It varies vintage to vintage.
Perfect.
So we're kind of medium size here in Napa Valley.
Yeah, there's much larger, and there's obviously the very tinies out there.
Yeah, I mean, they're very, very, very tiny, but Schaefer's smaller than us. Cakebread's considerably bigger than us. Of course, Duckhorn's huge compared to us. And Phelps, we're probably similar to Phelps, I would think.
Okay. Perfect. Well, one of the things that my brother always reminds me that I forget to say is that obviously we've got all of these wines in stock in our stores. Obviously, if you're there, if you're at home, we hope you come back and enjoy all the wines and pick your favorites out. I know some of the stores only brought in a little bit of some of them. I think Generations a 6-pack. So if we run out, I know in the States, we can always get more of them. Definitely reach out to your stores. But I just want to say, I'm not seeing any other questions right now, but now I want to say go ahead, Brian.
I have a question. It's more of a statement for you. I don't know if you can see this, Peter, but we had a guest that wanted me to show this to you. This is your dad's signature on here. This is a Magnum of 88 cab. It's empty.
Nice.
It's empty because I poured it over my head earlier. The customer wasn't happy about it, but I was pleased with it. So, but 88 little Cabernet Mag that your dad signed. So that's pretty cool.
Oh, that's fabulous. Hopefully you enjoyed your hair wash.
And let's hope and pray I don't shatter the bottle, giving it back to the guest. So,
yeah, absolutely.
You get a kick out of that. That's kind of cool.
Oh, that's fun. Hopefully it was enjoyed.
It was their anniversary year.
Oh, perfect.
The year they were married.
The year they were married. Would
Yeah.
you like to talk, Andrea? Because I'm more than happy. I'm more than happy to let. Yeah. So very, very cool. So
That's great.
We're gonna put some water in this and pretend like it's wine.
Don't forget a little red coloring in there too.
But I thought you'd like that.
Oh, that's fabulous. Especially enjoying it on an anniversary date too.
Right. Very good. All right, Jeff, I'll hand it back over to you. I'm done talking for now, but who knows when I might jump back in.
That's usually par for the course. He tells me to drive the show and then sends me 15 texts throughout the course of it. So anyway, I'm sure you know how that is. I just want to thank you, obviously, taking the time out, sharing the story, sharing the wines. These are amazing opportunities for us to learn more about that. You know, as he said, mentioned, they are open for business. People are back out and traveling. If and when you get out that way, this is one of our definitely must see wineries. I know a lot of the stores kind of keep little hidden lists of people to get a hold of and make recommendations and help get people in for tastings. And we always love to do that as well. And for all the lists we've always had, this has always been one of our top. So I definitely appreciate that. I thought we have wine information. Oh, we have information on their website for coming out and visiting. But otherwise, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank the folks at Charles Krug for helping make this happen. I know with logistics these days, that sometimes isn't always as easy. Getting from trucks that don't show up sometimes, and shipping and distributors and everything else in this crazy world that we have right now. With the 3-tier system. So appreciate that. And obviously all the folks out at all the stores. Look forward to our next event we have coming up. We don't have it scheduled yet, but we do have a date, but my mind escapes me for what it is. We'll be actually doing, I think, Nick Goldschmidt, another Napa Valley wine vintner that also does some things down in New Zealand. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the wines and hope to see you in our store soon.
Okay, thank you all. Enjoy the wines. Bye now.